The day my son stood in the middle of the Pike Tower lobby, pointed at my face, and said loud enough for 30 people to hear, "Do you even know who you are? You're the only man alive who can turn gold into trash. My mother handed you an empire, and you ruined it like scrap metal." The entire room switched into theater mode. He kept shouting, "All of Seattle knows you're only good at one thing, dragging my family to the bottom." The whispers spread like fire catching thin paper, and in that exact moment, I realized some wounds don't need knives, only a child who sees you as an obstacle on the ladder they want to climb. If you've ever been looked down on by your own child just because you're poorer than they think you should be, if you've ever been called a burden, if you've ever been treated like your worth is measured by the cash in your wallet, leave a single "yeah" so I know you're here with me, and tell me which city you're listening from. I honor every second you stay because some stories, only those who've taken a similar cut can truly feel. The woodshop where I work in Boise always holds an atmosphere I can't quite put into words. Warm yellow lights falling on floating sawdust, the scent of fresh pine drifting through the air like the breath of a house that's aged alongside time, and the steady hum of the table saw sounding like the heartbeat of a man trying to balance himself after a lifetime of slipping away from the things he dreamed of. I, Andrew Calder, once an interior architect designing Seattle penthouses in the 90s, now stand over a slab of rosewood, living quietly on calloused hands and small odd jobs that aren't enough for anyone to care about. And in that rare moment of calm, the old flip phone in my pocket buzzed, its pale green screen lighting up a smear of dust, showing the one name I had buried deep at the bottom of my life: Preston Rivera. For 22 years, my only son has reached out, not to check on me, not to reconcile, but to ensure I understood exactly where I stand in his world, as a failure, broke, useless, and unworthy of a place in his life. I opened the phone, his voice cut through the speaker, sharp as shattered glass. "Can you get to Seattle? Mom's dead. The lawyer will read the will." I gripped the workbench until my knuckles went white, but I kept my voice steady. "Why do I need to be there? I'm not legally tied to anything anymore." On the other end, a short, cold laugh. "The old will has your name. Washington State requires all involved parties to be present. They can't open the file without you." Then he lowered his voice, but made sure every syllable was crystal clear, like he wanted whoever stood around him to hear. "You're coming to sign the papers, confirming you're officially nothing in my life." Right after that came a familiar sound, the click of Natalie's high heels, Preston's new girlfriend, a woman convinced that designer bags determine worth, and wealthy men determine fate. The phone lit again. He sent exactly $20. Note: bus money, an amount so small it stung, like he was saying, "This is the entire value of a father in my life." For a man who spent a lifetime wanting to look his son in the eye as equals, it was a slap that needed no hand. I set the phone down, took a long breath to let the shop air fill my lungs, the pine, the dust, the life I'd stitched back together piece by piece after the fall of 2003. But this time, the scent of wood didn't comfort me. It just lingered under the yellow light, exposing a truth I never wanted to admit. For 22 years, I stayed silent because I was hurting. But now, I was silent because there was nothing left to lose. Some fires don't begin with shouting. They start with a tiny ember under ash, waiting for the right second to take flame again. And the moment I looked at the words, "bus money," I knew that ember, the one I thought I'd smothered, had just come alive. It carried a name I had run from for 22 years, Preston Rivera. In 2003, when my life was still running on the clean lines of light and composition, the architecture interior firm Rivera Atelier Group was already a familiar name in Seattle's real estate world. Back then, I was the lead architect and design director, a role that put me every day in the middle of dense sheets of schematics, shimmering material boards, and the concrete dreams wealthy clients always wanted turned into reality. Eleanor, who was both my wife and the company's CEO at the time, had a gift for turning any project into a golden promise for investors. But then the Seattle Marina Tower project, the waterfront high-rise marketed as the city's next architectural icon, began to show invisible fractures. Numbers didn't match. Financial reports were inflated. Promises Eleanor had made about timeline, quality, and investment returns to keep the capital flowing started turning into a noose, tightening around her neck. Investors whispered, then grew bold. They were preparing to sue her for fraudulent projection, false statements in the project's financials. And I, the man behind all interior design and cost control, began to see things I prayed I had misread. One late night on the 28th floor, where Seattle's lights reflected on the water like thousands of shards of glass, I discovered a chain of contracts sent from a Dubai partner. Contracts inflating interior costs to absurd levels. A $45,000 sofa listed as $230,000, a glass ceiling fixture written up as a bespoke artisan chandelier priced near $400,000. It didn't take much experience to see what was happening. Someone wanted to use Rivera Atelier Group as a channel to launder money through interior procurement. And every trace, every shell company, every transaction route just happened to lead straight back to the one person who signed off on technical documentation. Me. When I brought the file to Eleanor's desk, she didn't look at it right away. She pressed her hand to her temple, closed her eyes as if the whole world outside was just wind sliding through glass. When she opened them, her gaze was not that of the steel-strong CEO I once knew, but of a woman standing at the very edge of fear. Andrew. If this gets out, the company dies. Preston, he's too young. He needs a future. I looked at her for a long time, long enough for the faint flicker of the neon light above us to blur at the edges. The years we'd shared, the days when we were so broke, we used the same broken drafting easel. The nights we stayed up turning sketches into model homes, flooded back in that moment. And then a painful truth hit. Eleanor wasn't asking what we should do. She was waiting for the answer she wanted. Because I knew Eleanor so well, I knew exactly how desperate she was for someone to take the hit. I understood that if I stepped forward and took responsibility for the technical side, she would avoid a criminal investigation. I didn't do it out of naivety. I did it because I thought if even one of us stayed upright, Preston wouldn't have to grow up in a collapsed household. I chose to make myself the shield. The next morning, I walked into the FBI office. I brought the entire file, but when questioned, I told them I had failed to control the finance team, that I had been careless in verifying contracts tied to tax filings, and that the technical inconsistencies across the shell companies were on me. None of that was fully true, but I intentionally took the blame because I knew that by accepting the lesser charge, I could keep Eleanor out of legal danger. I thought I was doing the only thing left that could save our family. Thanks to the cooperation clause in the plea deal, I avoided prison, but the cost was brutal. My architecture license revoked, my reputation smeared, my career ended in a single emergency meeting, and my marriage dissolved with a signature so neat it hurt to look at. Preston, only 9 years old then, grew up with whatever story someone fed him, that his father was a ruinous man, the only person capable of turning gold into trash. And for the next 20 years, the way he looked at me carried one meaning only: contempt. I stayed silent all that time, not because I was weak, but because I believed Eleanor would eventually tell him the truth. I convinced myself she stayed quiet to protect Preston, that she was just waiting until he was old enough to understand the full picture. But maybe I guessed wrong. She never said a word. She let that one-sided story swallow my name whole. The morning I left Boise, the sky was covered in a thin gray layer, like tracing paper architects used to refine a line. I carried one old fabric suitcase, the kind whose corners had faded after nearly 2 decades of use, and wore a flannel shirt with cuffs so frayed that light could slip through the threads. In the airport restroom mirror, I saw a man I might not recognize if I passed him on the street, no longer the confident interior architect who once stood under crystal chandeliers, no longer the man with the sharp gaze defending a design concept before an investor board. What remained was someone who lived by his hands, and his quiet left hand holding a cheap plane ticket, right hand gripping the suitcase handle like a last anchor. As I waited in the boarding line, my phone buzzed. An Instagram notification lit up. I didn't open it, but the preview alone cut straight across my eyes. "My father's on his way. Looks homeless." Preston's voice in the short video was so clear, I thought he was standing right behind me. Natalie appeared in frame, curled hair, soft leather jacket, red lips, laughing. Seattle better prep a relief center for him. A few passengers beside me glanced at my screen, then at me, some with pity, some with curiosity, some of the tight-lipped half-smile people use when they're uncomfortable witnessing a man being turned into a public joke by his own child. I said nothing. In the plane cabin, as the engines roared up, I closed my eyes and let the vibrations pull me back to the years I flew Seattle Boyce, non-stop to sign interior design contracts, the days I stepped off the jetway in pressed clothes, complete portfolios, and a kind of pride I carried like armor. Now, on the same route, the only difference was that I sat by the window, trying to hide a suitcase with a torn corner under my foot. When the plane landed in Seattle, the familiar wet scent of the city slapped my face the moment I stepped through the jetway. Seattle hadn't changed much, only I had changed too much. The bus from the airport took me toward downtown, where Pike Tower rose like a steel-blue monolith of glass. I stood at its base, looking up at the facade, the interlaced glass panels, the brushed steel trims, all the aesthetics I once worshipped. But I no longer had the right to walk in as someone who understood it. Now I was only a shadow reflected on its surface. I stepped into the lobby. Cold marble, expensive perfume from office workers, high heels echoing across the floor. All of it shoved me back into the places I used to belong to and no longer did. I had barely taken a few steps when a hand blocked me. Security, tall, broad, black vest, polished badge. "Sir, this area is for scheduled clients. Free legal assistance is on the ground floor. Elevator on the left." It took me a second to understand. He thought I was here for free legal aid. I opened my mouth to respond, but instead just nodded and handed him the appointment letter from attorney Marcus Hale. His eyes changed immediately, curiosity mixed with irritation, the kind he probably felt when realizing he'd made the kind of mistake he shouldn't, but I didn't have the energy to care. At the reception desk, a young associate, maybe 27, 28, looked me over from head to toe. Slicked hair, Windsor knot tie, latte in hand. He leaned toward his coworker and whispered, not quietly enough, "That's the father?" Both of them held their stare a second longer, the kind of glance that splits the world into those who once lived on carpeted floors and those who've slept on wooden ones. A cold ribbon ran down my spine, not because of what they said, but because I realized I no longer recognized my place in this picture. Preston, somewhere on one of the upper floors, was likely sharpening that contempt in his eyes, preparing a performance. Natalie was probably fixing her lipstick for a live stream titled, "Watch My Dad Sign Himself into Nothingness." I stood still in the lobby's cold light, surrounded by eyes that passed over me like wind, and I said nothing. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the way a man gathers himself before stepping into the place meant to bury him, or the place meant to unearth a truth kept hidden for more than 20 years. And I knew the moment the elevator doors closed behind me, I was no longer the man who left Boise with a fraying suitcase. I was the man about to face his past. I was the man Preston forgot one simple thing about. Ashes can still ignite when the right wind hits. The lobby of Pike Tower looked more like a high-end interior showroom than a place where people came to settle a will. White marble with gray veining stretched underfoot, polished enough to reflect every thread of dust on my old shoes. The ceiling was high, hung with clusters of burnished bronze pendant lights, their glow angling down in thin gold slices like pieces of time trimmed by the hand of some cunning architect. It was the kind of space I once understood better than myself, but today it belonged to the world of people who dressed well, walked tall, and never had to wonder if they had any value left in them. I sat down on a leather chair near the wall, polished steel frame stitching straight as a blade. The cold leather cut through my flannel and made me shiver, but I didn't move. I set my hand on the old fabric suitcase, as if holding on to it was the only way not to lose my grip on who I still was. Office workers passed by, each glancing at me, indifferent, assessing, or the polite, strained kind reserved for someone whose social category they couldn't quite place. I lowered my head, took in a long breath of cold stone, expensive perfume, fresh printed paper, the kind of air I once helped craft for the waiting rooms of design projects long gone. Then the sound appeared, brisk, decisive footsteps, echoing off the marble like the opening cue of a play I wasn't invited to. Preston. I didn't need to look up to know, but I looked up, and so did the lobby. He walked in with the same posture I'd seen since he was a boy, shoulders slightly pushed back, chin lifted, steps that never once touched the ground gently. He wore a charcoal suit, a watch on his wrist so bright it reflected off the glass panel behind him. Conversations in the lobby paused for one beat. Not long, but long enough for me to feel the weight of the distance between the two worlds. Father and son now stood in. Preston looked at me, not like a father, but like a dated object misplaced in a luxury showroom. Then he spoke, the volume not loud but carried far by the marble. The $20 I sent you is the highest investment I've ever put into your life. The lobby froze for a second. I heard a soft, "Oh God," from a receptionist, so quiet others might have missed it, but my ears were sharper than glass in that moment. I still didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't react. Natalie stepped in behind him, clinging to his arm like an expensive accessory. She looked me up and down, paused exactly 3 seconds at my worn flannel, then laughed, bright and thin and sharp like champagne glasses clinking at a party I never belonged to. He even ironed that thrift store suit jacket. A pair of eyes near the elevator turned toward me, then toward them. A young male employee, phone in hand, lifted it instinctively, the reflex of his generation. I didn't need to look closely to know what he was doing, recording probably not out of malice, but because he sensed something irregular, something that might spread. Don't, I thought, but my lips didn't move, and he kept recording. Preston stepped closer, enough for the overhead lights to throw a cold sheen across his eyes. You can actually go straight to the 3rd floor if you want to sign the papers now, but looking like this, I'm pretty sure they'll think you're here for free legal aid. A few small, quick laughs flickered and died, the kind people make when they don't want trouble but can't stifle the reflex to react to someone being pushed into the smaller side of the scale. All of it happened in under 40 seconds. But for me, it stretched as long as the 22 years I'd spent trying to glue myself back together after 2003. I didn't stand, I didn't argue. I just looked into Preston's eyes for one brief moment, so brief he didn't notice the meaning, but long enough for me to know I wasn't afraid of that look anymore. Some battles don't begin with gunfire. They begin in the moment the person who thinks he can grind you under his heel fails to realize you're already rising from your own shadow. The conference room on the 3rd floor of Pike Tower didn't look like a place where people divided an inheritance. It looked like a miniature Scandinavian minimalist gallery. Smooth white oak panels, black leather Eames-style chairs, warm amber lighting spread evenly like a layer of manufactured fog, still enough that even the sound of a pen dropping could be heard. I sat on the left side of the long wooden table, my back against the cold frame of the chair, a bottle of water in front of me, the kind of courtesy receptionists hand out because etiquette demands it. Preston sat across from me, legs crossed, carrying the easy posture of someone convinced this match had been scripted long ago and that the winner had already been named. Natalie sat beside him, her long legs angled at a perfect editorial pose. The door opened and Marcus Hale walked in. He was in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a navy suit, tailored so sharply you didn't need to see the label to know it cost no less than $2,000. He set his case on the table, unlocked it, then looked up. I saw him hesitate. His eyes paused on my face for exactly 1 second. Long enough to recognize me, short enough not to show it. Mr. Andrew Calder? His voice dipped, carrying the sound of someone not entirely sure he believed what he was seeing. I remember you from the 2003 file. A cold draft slid down my spine, not from fear, but because for the first time in 20 years, someone spoke of that past without contempt. Preston rolled his eyes, chin tilted. You don't have to be polite. Just read. His legs twitched under the table like someone impatient to unwrap a toy he'd ordered online. Marcus opened the first file, adjusted his glasses, and spoke with a tone so even and professional that each word sounded like a judge's gavel tapping the table. According to the will drafted 12 years ago, all assets, properties, shares, and controlling interest in Rivera Atelier Group shall be transferred to Preston Rivera. Preston leaned back and smiled, a smile so triumphant it could have been packaged as marketing material for a luxury brand's total victory campaign. I saw it clearly. He believed this was his coronation, the moment he'd waited his whole life to prove he was right. And I was wrong. But Marcus didn't turn the next page. He closed the file and said in a calm, unsettling voice, "However, that is the old will. 7 months before her passing, Mrs. Eleanor Rivera rewrote everything with an added codicil." Preston's grip on the chair tightened, his expression snapping into tension. "Then read the new one already?" he snapped, his voice pitched too high, pulled out of its comfort zone. Marcus maintained the composure of someone who had read thousands of wills, witnessed thousands of disputes, and knew exactly when someone was losing control. He opened the second file, a thicker black folder edged in silver and sealed in red wax. Under the warm light, the silver trim looked like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. "I need everyone to remain calm," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on Preston like a warning, "because from this point on, what I'm about to read will change the entire landscape." Preston let out a laugh, a strained, brittle, insecure sound. "I don't care about any landscape. Read it." Natalie squeezed his arm, trying to salvage his image in front of the attorney and staff, but he shook her off. I stayed still, unmoving. But inside me, something shifted. A faint sound like the hinges of an old door slowly opening after being locked for 20 years. I felt the cold radiate from the sealed folder in front of Marcus. "Mr. Andrew," Marcus suddenly said, turning toward me, "you may want to brace yourself." I nodded slightly, not because I knew what was coming, but because for the first time in 20 years, my life was no longer held hostage by someone else's silence. Preston slammed back in his chair and barked, louder this time. "I said read it! Or are you trying to drag this out for clicks like some TikTok clown?" Marcus shut his eyes for a brief second, exhaled slowly, then began. "According to the new will of Mrs. Eleanor Rivera," and the room, quiet as a stone-cold gallery, pulled taut like a wire of steel. One more word would snap it. Marcus opened the second file with a slow, precise movement that made me feel as if he were unsealing a rare vintage design piece rather than a will. When the strip of red waxed paper tore, the entire room seemed to shift temperature. The air, once cool, thickened into something heavy, like every person was holding a breath they weren't yet allowed to release. Before we reached the main estate, Marcus read, eyes scanning each line, Mrs. Eleanor has a series of personal gifts. Preston scoffed, folding his arms. All right, let's entertain the room. Marcus didn't react. He continued. First gift, $20,000 to Mrs. Sinclair, her personal secretary for 13 years. At the far end of the table, a middle-aged woman covered her mouth in shock. Preston glanced over, lips curled. Probably to upgrade her old computer. Marcus turned the page. Second gift, $12,000 to Mr. Ortega, the penthouse housekeeper. An older man bowed his head. Preston laughed louder, an empty clang like metal hitting cold stone. 12,000, maybe he can buy a better mop, Marcus read on, unmoved. Third gift, $15,000 to Mr. Blake, her private driver. Near the door, the driver nodded shyly, eyes wet. Preston shrugged, flicking his hand. Pocket change. Natalie laughed softly, sharply. That's Eleanor being generously frugal. I noticed something small but important. Every person named was standing out in the lobby, and other staff had already begun peeking in. Preston thought this was his stage, but he didn't realize he was the one under the spotlight, not controlling it. Marcus turned another page. Fourth gift, to Ms. Natalie. The room's air changed instantly. Natalie smoothed her hair, straightened her posture, and her lips already lifted into a victory smile. Preston shot her a look that said, Told you. Marcus read, voice steady, One Rivera Atelier handbag, limited edition. Natalie's smile widened. Preston smiled with her. Then Marcus lowered his tone, enunciating each word. Note, replica, to match her aesthetic. In the marble-cold room, Natalie's face, draining of color, happened so quickly it could have been used in a facial expression seminar. She jerked upright, eyes blown wide, hand to her chest as if someone had forced her to breathe thin air. Heads began to turn. An employee whispered, Oh my God, loud enough for half the room to hear. Preston flinched, turning to her. Don't take it personally. She was... But Natalie had already pulled her hand away, eyes glued to Marcus's paper, as if it had just exposed the truth she feared most, her own transparent greed. Marcus went on, giving the moment no time to settle. Fifth gift, $8,000 to Mr. Daniels, Preston's financial advisor. Preston frowned. Daniels, seated near the corner, looked up. Marcus read the note. For the ethics class, you failed. When Marcus said, ethics class, you failed, everyone understood it wasn't a gift. It was a slap to his professional integrity. Daniels had failed ethics years ago for violating protocol, and now he was being exposed in front of a crowd. His face went crimson, hands clenched. Everyone knew this was public humiliation. Preston shifted repeatedly, heel tapping the chair legs, his gaze unfocused. These were no longer small gifts. They were concealed blades, wrapped in tissue paper, opened one by one so the room could witness how pain doesn't need blood to be undeniable. Natalie turned away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Daniels bowed his head, burning. Preston, for the first time since walking into the building, looked down. And I stayed still. Not a smirk, not a flicker of satisfaction, because I knew this was only the warm-up. Eleanor hadn't saved the final blade for her staff. She hadn't saved it for her acquaintances. She had saved it for her own son. And I felt the room tighten, all the lights narrowing onto one inevitable point. The name Preston Rivera, waiting to be read next under the lines Eleanor had left behind. Marcus lowered his eyes to the page, pausing for exactly one beat. Before reading the line he knew would change the temperature of the entire room. Then he spoke, slowly, low and sharp as a polished steel edge. To my former husband, Andrew Calder, I leave to you the one and only key to the confidential Rivera Atelier Master Vault. No one in the room reacted in time. The air froze in a single breath, silence not created but dropped over everyone like a pane of heavy glass. Everyone understood instantly what that meant. Not a regular vault, but the place where Eleanor kept her professional secrets, original designs, and internal documents she had guarded as the lifeblood of the Rivera Atelier brand, and the only person granted access was me. Even people watching from the lobby through the glass stopped moving. Natalie's eyes flew open, Daniel stopped breathing, and Preston, he shot to his feet, like he'd been electrocuted. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching across the wood floor, sharp and violent. No, that's impossible. He never had any key. He pointed directly at me, face flushed red. He's lying. Crack the vault open. Open it now. I stayed seated, but my heart hammered hard enough to hurt. One key? Eleanor's master vault? I hadn't seen it in 20 years. I'd never been given anything. I didn't understand what was happening. I swallowed, then said slowly, one word at a time, I never received any key. Marcus nodded as if he had expected exactly that. He lifted the bridge of his glasses, voice perfectly steady. According to the wording in this will, the key was not meant to be given beforehand. It is to be delivered here, during the reading today. A second wave of silence rolled through the room, heavier, deeper. No one needed further explanation. They all understood that everything Preston had just screamed was instantly invalid. Preston broke, voice cracking in panic. There is no way Eleanor would give the most important thing to him. That vault is mine. That is my legacy. Marcus set the file down, his hands calm, his tone not raised but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to stating the law. If the will confirms there is only one key and the recipient is Mr. Calder, then no attorney may authorize the vault to be drilled. No judge will approve it. There are no exceptions. Preston opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Every gaze in the room shifted toward me, not because I'd been chosen, but because they all understood one unmistakable truth. Eleanor had held on to the most important secret of her life, and the only person she entrusted it to was the man everyone assumed she'd abandoned decades ago. In that moment, Preston didn't need to be insulted. He didn't need harsh words. He didn't need a fight. One sentence in a will, and the entire empire of power, confidence, and dominance he had built for 20 years slid out of his hands immediately. This was the first moment, clear, cold, irreversible, where the battle changed sides. Marcus slid his hand into the sealed black folder, letting his fingers brush the red wax as if he were touching not paper, but the detonator of a bomb buried for 2 decades. When the wax cracked, the sound was so small, only the people holding their breath could hear it. Yet it changed the color of the air in the room. He unfolded the codicil, Eleanor's final addendum. The paper was ivory-aged, the ink a deep black, and her signature at the bottom cut sharp and steady, like a blade that didn't tremble. Marcus lifted his head, looked at the entire room, and read, I, Eleanor Rivera, write these lines so the truth does not get buried with me. Preston went rigid. Natalie slid her chair back, fingers digging into her sleeve. Beyond the frosted glass, 3 other attorneys had stopped walking, pretending to be in transit but staring in like spectators who didn't buy a ticket to this trial but found themselves front row. Marcus continued. First, Andrew did not commit any wrongdoing in the 2003 case. I know that. I know it very clearly. I shut my eyes for a second. That sentence, just that one, was enough to put a crack through 20 years of pressure sitting on my chest. Marcus read on, peeling back layers of deceit, with a voice that was low, calm, and merciless. I forced Andrew to take the blame to protect the company, to protect myself, and to protect the child I believed would grow up grateful. I put Andrew in front as the shield, because I knew that if he signed the plea deal, I would walk free. Preston whipped his head toward me, eyes searching for something, an excuse, a crack, anything that could keep him from believing this. But Marcus didn't pause. He turned the page. Second, Preston is the product of my own indulgence, an overgrown child who has never worked a real day in his life, yet spends money as if he owns the assets of the entire world. A wave of whispering rippled through the staff gathered outside. No one bothered to hide it anymore. They couldn't. Eleanor's words were too sharp for anyone to pretend they weren't being cut. Preston slammed his palm on the table and shot to his feet. "Enough! She's lying!" But Marcus read on, and the next lines were crafted to demolish the mask Preston had worn for years. "I have watched Preston become a leech, an actual parasite, who believes he deserves everything simply for carrying the Rivera name." A receptionist outside cupped her hand over her mouth. A young associate leaned toward his colleague and whispered, barely audible, "Holy God, she wrote it outright." Marcus kept his tone steady. He delivered the next line, the one Eleanor had carved so hard the letters pressed deep into the page. "And as for Natalie, she does not love Preston. She loves Preston's credit card. A gold-dipped leech, a parasite gilded in shine, clinging only where the metal glitters." Natalie went pale as if slapped by a glacier. She lurched to her feet, chair nearly tipping, her mouth open but unable to form a sound. Preston turned toward her, but she dodged his gaze like it was contagious. The lobby outside was now full, staff, attorneys, even a few clients who had just arrived, everyone trying to pretend they weren't watching, but not a single person leaving. Not one. This was no longer a will reading. This was a public reckoning, Eleanor's final verdict, delivered in real time. Marcus lowered the page, finishing the letter. "I write these lines with what clarity I have left, not for revenge, but to restore the honor of the only person who ever truly sacrificed in this family." He looked at me. No one else, only me. Preston broke into tears, not the sorrowful kind, but the panicked collapse of someone who just watched his entire constructed identity ripped open in front of a crowd he once expected to applaud him. And in that moment, under the warm lights, under dozens of staring eyes, Preston Rivera was no longer the victor of his own life. He was just a man standing in front of the truth, with nowhere left to hide. The room seemed like it had already hit peak tension at Eleanor's letter, but it turned out that was only the breath before the real drop. Preston shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table so hard his water glass bounced and tipped, the spill streaking across the edge of the files. Paper soaked and spread like an open wound. How could she write this?" he shouted, something sharp in his voice like glass scraping stone. Then he snatched the same glass and flung the water straight onto the codicil, as if he could destroy evidence capable of burning him alive. Droplets splattered across Marcus's sleeve. Marcus didn't flinch. He just stared at Preston with the eyes of a man who had watched hundreds of courtrooms, where people collapsed under the weight of their own loss of control. Footsteps thundered in, building security storming in. Two men, broad-shouldered black vests, earpieces. Preston backed up, chest heaving, his face so red the veins along his temple looked ready to burst. Natalie shot up, her chair clattering to the floor. She looked Preston over from head to toe like she was assessing merchandise past its shelf life. "I don't date broke men," she said, crisp and icy. "I don't date broke men or mama's boys." Then she grabbed her bag and walked out, her heels striking the marble in a steady rhythm like a hammer sealing a coffin shut. Preston whipped toward her, eyes wide with a kind of naked desperation he had never allowed anyone to see. But today, dozens of people witnessed it. Daniels, his financial advisor, rose, straightened his tie, and walked out too, without a glance back, no goodbye, no explanation, no loyalty. Just the brutal truth. The ship was sinking, and everyone wanted off first. The room fell silent, so silent you could hear the AC cycle for the third time. A silence thick as cold fog standing still in a stone mansion on a hill. No one dared breathe too deeply. No one touched their glass. Preston stood there, alone, no girlfriend, no allies, no one at his side. Marcus turned a page as if the water incident had never happened. His voice didn't change. And now, he paused half a beat, letting the pulse pounding at Preston's temple throb louder in the frozen air. We come to the inheritance of Preston Rivera. Every eye locked on Marcus. Then he read, Preston inherits exactly the amount he gave his father. Marcus held his gaze. $20. The room crackled, whispers igniting like sparks in dry brush. A receptionist outside slapped a hand over her mouth, lowering her head to hide the, "Oh my God," that slipped out. A young associate turned away, shoulders shaking as he tried to choke down a laugh. Preston drained of color in a single second. He staggered back, hitting the wall. His face went ghost pale, his lips trembling, his eyes wide as if he'd just been thrown out of the world he believed he ruled. And then he looked at me. His eyes swirled with something between hatred, desperation, and humiliation. He lunged toward me. No words, no shouting, just launched forward like a trapped animal at the edge of survival. I barely had time to shift my chair before the two guards seized him, twisting both arms behind his back. "Let go of me! Let go of me! Please!" he screamed, his voice cracking apart, every shred of dignity gone. No CEO, no swagger, just a man being dragged out of the room, along with every mask he had ever worn. When the door slammed shut behind him, the room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Preston, the man who thought he owned everything, lost it all in 5 minutes. And in that exact moment, it wasn't just his money that vanished. His dignity went bankrupt, too. Marcus slowly closed Preston's inheritance section, setting the page aside the way a doctor might after declaring the moment a patient shows no remaining signs of life. He shifted to the final folder, the thickest, heaviest one, edged in bright silver. The warm overhead light caught along its spine, making it look like a metal door about to open. He lifted his eyes and looked directly at me. "And now," Marcus said, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight everyone in the room could feel, "we come to the primary distribution of Mrs. Eleanor Rivera's estate." Breathing halted across the room. No one outside the glass pretended to work anymore. They stood still, eyes locked inward as if watching a historic verdict. Marcus opened the first page. According to the final will and the codicil signed 7 months before her death, he paused, then read each word with surgical clarity. The entire estate, valued at 190 million United States dollars, is transferred to Andrew Calder. The only sound was a pen falling onto the marble floor. Not applause, not gasps, just the stillness of a courtroom when the sentence has been delivered. Marcus went on, including 100% ownership of Rivera Atelier Group, full operational authority, all real estate assets, including the Seattle penthouse, every interior design copyright, original blueprints, and all intellectual property tied to the brand. As he read the last figure, I caught sight of a silhouette standing at the edge of the hallway. Natalie had walked out, abandoning Preston without a word. But she hadn't gone far. She stood pressed against the corridors, glass line leaning just enough to see in, her expression tight as if she needed confirmation that Preston's fall was as deep as she suspected. The makeup on her face looked pale under the artificial light, stripped of its earlier pride and replaced with raw calculation. Nearby, a few younger staff members froze mid-step, and Daniels, halfway down the hall, stopped cold when he saw Natalie staring back into the room, as though the entire hallway were being gravity-pulled into this moment. Daniels, who had walked out earlier, didn't take another step, and Preston was already held outside by security, but his voice bled through the glass, choking, panicked, like someone losing air. "No, no, no way, no way." Marcus folded the folder shut and continued with the tone of an attorney who had already prepared every outcome. All assets have been pre-approved by the board. Every component of the transfer of authority, including shares, administration, and intellectual property, has been executed. No one has standing to contest. He placed another packet on the table. The Internal Revenue Service has confirmed exemption and allocation for estate tax. No clawback, no liabilities. Everything is cleared. Heads turned toward Marcus because they knew what that meant. IRS clearing meant the estate was fully ripened, fully transferred, untouchable. Marcus delivered the final line, his voice not raised, but weighted like a vault door sealing shut. And all assets above, under the final clause of the will, are transferred into the Calder Rivera Trust, with Mr. Andrew Calder as the sole trustee. Sole trustee. 2 words that landed like an electronic lock sliding into place, silent, complete, unreachable by any other hand. Every gaze in the room fell on me, but I felt no triumph, no victory, no satisfaction watching Preston collapse. I felt only a hollow coldness spreading through my chest, as someone had just handed me a tower, so enormous I had no idea where its first broken beam even was. I drew a long, steady breath. I paused, flattening my voice so it wouldn't shake. This isn't a reward. Marcus tilted his head, listening. I went on, slow, deliberate, laying each word like the first stones of a rebuilt foundation. This is a responsibility. No one argued, no one nodded, no one spoke, because everyone understood one thing with absolute clarity. My life had been buried under a lie, and today the power handed to me wasn't meant for revenge, but to rebuild the structure that had been shattered for 20 years. That afternoon, Seattle was wrapped in a thin gray sheet of cloud, like a piece of fabric filtering the daylight. I stood by the glass of the top floor of Pike Tower, looking down at rain-soaked roofs and the slow crawl of headlights gliding through intersections. This city had once been the center of everything in my life: work, reputation, love, and it was also the place where everything collapsed with a single brief news headline about tax irregularities. Now it sat below me, silent. Behind me, Marcus set a small object on the long wooden table in the penthouse living room. The sound of metal touching dry wood was soft but sharply clear. "You forgot this," he said. I turned. On the table lay a small silver key, an old-style design with a rounded head and a slender body, but crafted so precisely the light caught every edge. It didn't look like an apartment key or an office key. It looked like the kind made for locks no one was meant to touch. "This is," I asked. Marcus lifted it gently between 2 fingers. "This is the confidential key," he said, "the one Eleanor called the real key." He placed it into my hand, his palm warm, the key cold as though it had just been taken out of ice. "Per instructions," Marcus continued, "it could only be given to you after the reading of the will, and only if you accepted the responsibility of trustee." I held the key, feeling the metal press into my skin. Part of me wanted to set it back on the table, walk away and say I'd had enough secrets for 20 years. But another part, the part that had been buried alive under the paperwork of 2003, knew that if I didn't open this, then every apology and every declaration in that conference room would remain just words. "Where's the vault?" I asked. Marcus looked toward the rosewood wall on the right side of the living room, the same wall Eleanor and I once fought over, arguing furiously about veneer versus solid wood. "Behind that," he said. "She called it the Rivera Atelier, confidential vault. Only 2 people ever knew about it, her and now you." We walked to the wall. The rosewood was oiled to a soft sheen, grain flowing in long waves, showing no visible seam. If you didn't know, you'd never believe there was an empty space behind it. Marcus felt along the corner for a hidden catch and pressed. A dry click sounded. A wood panel slid aside, revealing a small metal door the size of 2 hands, almost invisible unless you were standing right in front of it. The lock sat centered, a precision mechanical lock unmistakable in its craftsmanship. I lifted the key. Metal touched metal, and the contact rang through the quiet room, like the sound of a clock restarting after years of silence. I turned the key. A deep, decisive latch shifted. The vault door opened a sliver, exhaling a stream of old air, paper, ink, and the faint scent of long-stored wood. Inside there was no money, no jewelry, nothing that glittered, only documents, files stacked neatly, pale yellow manila folders with edges slightly worn. On the front of the first folder, Eleanor's handwriting was clear and unmistakable. Case file, 2003, Calder Rivera. I pulled the file out and set it on the console table by the window. The late Seattle light slid across the paper, illuminating lines of bold black text. Marcus stepped back, arms folded. Not a guide anymore, but a witness. The first folder was a complete copy of the 2003 file, the contracts with the Dubai partner, the emails about interior price elevation, my red pen notes, and the rest of it, the part I had never seen. There were internal memos sent to Eleanor warning about possible money laundering through interior expenditures, warnings she had received, but at the time she was pinned between investor pressure and the fear of the company collapsing. She chose to look away, telling herself that if she could just get through that storm, she could fix everything later. There was also my original report, clearly stating I refused to sign off on those absurd numbers without justification, the report that had somehow disappeared from the official case file that year. I turned the page. A fax was clipped between the documents, the paper slightly yellowed but the ink still sharp. A header from an FBI office, the line bold. Subject, Andrew Calder, not a target. Beneath it, based on cooperation and provided documentation, Mr. Calder is no longer considered a target of investigation. I didn't need to read the rest. Just the words, not a target, were enough to knot my chest. For 20 years to the world, I was the man involved in a tax scandal. To my son, I was the failure who pled to avoid prison. But here, in a vault hidden behind the wood panel I had designed myself, was the page stating that to the FBI, the only people with the authority to charge me, I had never been a target at all. I gripped the folder edge, trying to keep my hand from shaking. The second folder was thinner, kept separately, no printed title. Only Eleanor's familiar handwriting in the corner. For Andrew. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages long. Blue ink, the script trembling slightly on the last lines, but still the same handwriting I had seen on the earliest concept sketches we ever worked on together. Andrew, the first line read, if you're reading this, it means I no longer have the chance to be a coward again. I read each sentence, each word, feeling like I was listening to an old voice echoing out from inside the walls. She wrote about that night in 2003, about the panic when the partners threatened lawsuits, when investors wanted to drag the entire company into court. She admitted she had ordered the legal department to shift the shell companies under my name to protect herself and the brand. She wrote, I knew you were innocent. I also knew you would believe that if you took responsibility for the technical discrepancies, I would have time to fix everything and eventually tell the truth. But I was a coward. I let you walk into the fire for me, let you carry the full heat of the scandal, while I stood outside and let the world believe you were at fault. I stopped there for a long moment, not because I was surprised, I had suspected this for years, but because it was the first time it had ever been written down, no longer an assumption. Under that, she gave another reason, harsh but honest. I thought Preston needed someone to blame if his life didn't turn out the way he wanted, and I let you become the shadow he could step on, so he wouldn't step on me. I lifted my eyes toward Seattle. The sky had darkened. The harbor lights flickered faintly, dots scattered across a sheet of lead. I turned to the last page. Eleanor wrote that after the case closed, she sent repeated compensation payments into a private account under my name, with notes like, for future projects, for your studio, for anything that is not me. In the vault, clipped behind the letter, was a stack of wire transfer receipts, regular payments in the early years after the scandal, amounts of $40,000, $60,000, $100,000. I knew you wouldn't use it, she wrote. You're too proud. You'd leave it untouched as proof of a mistake I refused to face. So I kept the records here, somewhere you would only see when you were ready to look back. If one day Preston is forced to face the truth, I want to begin by giving you the one thing I couldn't buy, your honor. I didn't sit. I didn't cry. I just stood there, hand resting on the edge of the file, like an architect looking at the final drawing of a structure he once believed was lost. Eleanor wanted you to see all of it, Marcus said quietly, as if loudness might break something fragile in the room. She just never had the courage to give it to you herself. I folded the letter, placed it gently back where it belonged, then reopened the FBI fax to look at the words, "Not a target," once more. In my head, the sounds of all the years in the Idaho woodshop, the planer, the saws, the clack of lumber, seemed to fade into the distance. For 20 years I had lived like a man permanently marked, but all those years only the newspapers saw me as guilty. In the actual FBI records, the only records that mattered, my name had never been on the target list. I exhaled, slow and long, not relief, not fully. Nothing can return my youth, my marriage, or my son's respect. But for the first time in 2 decades, I felt something like the old foundation of myself emerging beneath the rubble. Not complete, but solid enough to build on. Honor, I said softly, more to myself than to Marcus, isn't always restored in front of the world. Sometimes it gets cleaned in the places the world never sees, like this vault. Seattle outside was still gray, still damp, still cold, but the lights inside the penthouse reflected off the file pages and the silver key on the table, creating a different kind of glow, not dramatic, not triumphant, just the glow of a truth finally willing to step out of the dark. And I understood. This was the one part of the inheritance only I could use properly, not the money. The right to stand up straight from now on when someone says the name Andrew Calder. The first morning I returned to Boise after everything that had happened, the air carried that light, dry mountain cold, unique to Idaho. My woodshop was still there, tucked between 2 old pine trees, its sheet metal roof weather-stained, and the small window forever blurred with sawdust from the inside. I opened the door. The smell of alder, cedar, and fine wood shavings rose up like an old memory. For 20 years, this place was all I had left. A small corner no one could take, no one could fight over, no one could weaponize against me. But today it felt different. Not because I had a fortune in my name, not because I'd suddenly become the heir to a company, but because for the first time in 20 years, I stepped into the shop without carrying the humiliation of bowing to my past. I set my suitcase down, took off my coat, and flipped the switch on the yellow lamp hanging from the ceiling. The warm light fell across the old workbench, where I had once carved plank after plank, just to forget the rumors, the contempt, the eyes that judged me, and Preston's words, "You're a zero," thrown at me in every phone call. This time, that same light didn't make me feel small. It felt like the illumination of a new blueprint inside my head, young, clean, and large enough to cover whatever I want to build with the rest of my life. Marcus had finished all the paperwork. The assets, the shares, the penthouse, the design copyrights, they had all been transferred into the Calder Rivera Trust. And I, the man once labeled a washed-up fraud dodging prison, was the only person with authority over the fate of Rivera Atelier. But I knew I couldn't spend a single dollar of it on myself. 20 years had taught me that 2 things, once lost, no amount of money can ever buy back: time and honor. Time I cannot recover, But honor, I found it in a vault that smelled of old paper. And if I used this fortune to buy a car, a house, a vacation, then the truth Eleanor left behind would be cheapened into a financial transaction. I'd never allow that. So I began with the first thing. I established the Calder Atelier Scholarship for poor kids in Idaho with talent for design, sculpture, or interiors. Kids with no one to back them, kids like I was at 18. I wanted them to see the world through the eyes of an architect, not someone just trying to survive. I contacted a group of young artisans in Seattle who had once worked for Rivera Atelier, invited them back to transform the company's headquarters into a free vocational center where anyone could learn to make something with their hands. No grades, no tuition, just passion and a willingness to get their hands dirty. That part belonged to Eleanor. I returned it to the world. As for my part, I kept every sound in my Boise shop. The saw hum, the warm afternoon light on. Golden wood grain, the pencil sketch drafts still faint with graphite. One afternoon, while I was wiping down the workbench, the door opened. Preston stood there. No designer coat, no arrogance. His face was ashen like someone who'd lost direction entirely. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders sagging. "Dad," he said, the word catching. "I want to talk." I looked up. For 20 years I had imagined this moment 100 different ways. Imagined an apology, remorse, some sentence that would make me believe the boy he once was still buried somewhere inside the man in front of me. But what I saw was just a person who had lived on privilege so long, he didn't know how to stand when it was gone. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, voice hoarse. I set the cloth down. A thin cloud of wood dust lifted from the surface, glowing in the evening light. "Preston," I said, "you want forgiveness?" He nodded quickly, almost desperately. I looked straight into his eyes and said the one thing I knew had to be the foundation of any reconciliation. If such a thing could ever happen, do the first real thing in your life, work. He froze. No shouting, no arguing, no running. Just stood there as if realizing he'd never done anything with his own hands before. When Preston left, the late afternoon light had turned honey-colored. I returned to my bench, placing my hand on the oldest sketch I still kept. A pencil interior concept Eleanor once dismissed as not commercial enough. Back then I believed her. Now I know, not everything beautiful needs to be monetized. In the shop, Idaho wine slipped through the door crack, lifting the sawdust into the air, each tiny particle catching the light like metal flecks. I watched them float and fall, light, free, without weight. And I understood. Of all the things Eleanor left, money, a company, copyrights, an entire design empire, the only thing I truly needed was the truth. The money wasn't the gift she left. The truth was the inheritance. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with the quiet exhale of a man finally standing straight after 20 years, buried under a lie. I don't need anyone to believe me. I only need that fax from the vault, and I only need my own nod in the mirror each morning. If you've stayed with me all the way here, it means you understand this. Sometimes what saves a person isn't money, isn't reputation. It's the moment the truth steps out of the dark. And when it does, silence alone is enough for the whole world to hear it. If you've ever had to rise from a false accusation, if you've ever had to clean your own name while the world turned its back, or if you've stayed silent because no one would listen, leave a single. So I know there are people like me out there, and tell me where you're listening from. And if you want to walk with me through the journeys where truth finally finds its voice, you know what to do.